Welcome to episode 9 of the Maveric Banking Edge podcast series. Today, we have with us Marcia Tal, CEO of Tal Solutions. Hosted by P. Venkatesh, Director, Thought Leadership at Maveric Systems, to discuss about understanding and managing consent orders in the financial industry.
Welcome to the Maverick Banking Edge podcast series on the regulatory compliance. Today we have a special person because the subject is also very, very special and very important one. And I have with me Marcia Tal, the founder and CEO of Tal Solutions, which consults with global institutions on their strategy, operating model, and the governance part. She had a very, very long career with Citi, donning roles across the globe. She was also awarded the Citi Distinguished Alumni Award for Sustainability, Environmental, Social, and Governance. Marcia, thank you so much for joining the podcast with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Very nice. Marcia, see, the subject which we wanted to discuss is about the consent orders and why there has been such a rise in the number of consent orders of recently. What does it show in the banking system? What deficiencies is the root cause for such consent orders? And what do you think as the way forward that the financial institutions can adopt to manage such orders in the future? Now, let me turn to the first one. Why has there been such a rise? What are the drivers for such an increase in the number of consent orders? Is it because of the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis that the banks have started looking at systemically important banks globally or nationally, or the economic situation, or there is other drivers which are behind this?
So once again, thank you for having me here. I think when you ask such a broad question, right, and you think about the dynamics and the continuous evolution of what's taking place in our financial systems globally, then yes, you need to look back in time, but at the same time also look forward. And so the first thing I would say is clearly there is a relationship to the increased scrutiny and the financial crisis that took place in 2008, because that financial crisis really highlighted weaknesses that we had in the system. So as a result of that, I think there's been a lot of reevaluation of what needs to be the standards and the way in which we not only regulate, but the way in which we manage, right, our financial institutions for safety and soundness, for compliance, for consumer protection, all the things that financial responsibilities make kind of or have requirements. So number one, there's clearly a relationship between the financial crisis. Then there is the relationship of economic volatility. So in my opinion, right, as the economies change, as dynamics within the economies change, the impact on institutions, on small businesses, on consumers, right, also changes. And as a result, the way in which they interact with financial institutions, right, is really aligned with the state of the economy. And so we need to make sure that we have an alignment there as well. And as an example, you could see that a lot kind of with sometimes I look at things pre-pandemic, pandemic, post-pandemic, right? Because you obviously see what all the changes that took place. And even post-pandemic, there's still kind of a relationship to what happened during the pandemic. And that is something that has a long a long wind to it. The third thing I would say is that, the large global, systematically important financial institutions carry a lot of responsibility and weight in terms of protecting our financial system and in terms of also, I think, supporting and sustaining kind of our economic conditions. And so as a result of that, these banks really are scrutinized in ways that are deep and broad. I sometimes like to use those terms. So you have to go very, very deep, and you have to look very broadly to understand the way in which not only are they managed, but their policies, their practices, how products kind of need to evolve. So that's another thing. And lastly, I would say, and one of those more dynamic areas is the, responsible use of evolving technology. So as technologies kind of get more integrated into the way in which our banking systems use them, we need to evolve our regulatory and compliance oversights as well to make sure we're doing things in what you would say safe and sound ways, in ways that are ethically responsible, and that we understand the impact of these types of technologies on all of our constituents. It's interesting, back in, I think it was 2021, in the United States, there were the major regulatory agencies, US regulatory agencies, got together and put out an RFI asking, in fact, questions about how AI and machine learning, as an example, right, should be integrated into the modeling capabilities, right, for financial institutions. This is just one example of the way in which agencies also understand that they need to evolve the way they're regulating, but also they're seeking input from financial institutions as well as the public at large.
Thank you so much for delineating the key drivers, Marcia. And from what you mentioned, among the compliance, the risk, the consumer protection, and the financial crime related ones, which are the areas where most of the consent orders emanate, and why?
Well, I actually think that they're related. And so I don't think that, I think there are dependencies across all of the consent order issues that you just described. So we'll start with, say, operational deficiencies. Operational deficiencies drive impact on, whether it be on your clients, whether they're large global institutions or whether they're consumers, right? But the operational deficiencies that are highlighted, right, are affecting the safety and soundness of the system. So, there is a lot of scrutiny going on within these audits, and that drive ultimately to the overall evaluations that kind of get you, to either a consent order or not, right? Based on the processes, the systems, the controls that you have in place. So that's kind of number one. Now, if you have an operational deficiency, chances are, right, you're going to have some type of a compliance issue. And this starts to become more and more complex as we have a more crowded ecosystem, I would say, within the financial institutions, because there have been over the years the introduction of many third parties, right, that now kind of are core to the infrastructure and the workings of the financial institutions. So therefore, the regulatory oversight, the accountability around that is spread, but actually needs to be managed, proactively managed between the institutions and the third parties. And I think that's still an evolving space. And we see that, right, especially for smaller institutions that have a lot of their infrastructure supported by other banks. So we can see that there needs to be more consistency in the way in which the oversight takes place when you're looking at kind of the third-party integrations between banks and technology companies, between banks and fintechs. All of these things drive kind of risks within compliance. Then I think there clearly have been cases of kind of evaluation of the adequacy of capital reserves. And I think there it's really emphasizing again stability that is going to ensure protection during different periods of economic volatility. It's a lot of stress testing that takes place, right? And within the stresses that you put on the financial system, you really need to look at this again, deep and broad, and challenge kind of how bad could it really get. That's the whole purpose of these stress tests and ensuring that you can kind of basically you can survive in any type of environment that you can imagine. And then you've got consumer protection, something that's very near and dear to my heart as someone that's spent the majority of her career within consumer banking. And I think that when you consider, right, the things that I just said, specifically operational deficiencies and their impact on consumers, right, it can demonstrate itself through the way consumers are expressing, difficulties, whether that be in what they're perceiving to be unfair practices, whether it be that they don't understand the policies and why things happen the way in which they happen. So there's an education component as well as there's a responsibility within kind of, consumer protection. And there are a lot of ways to gain insights in this area, even by using, in fact, the words of the consumers themselves. So it's important to use the data that you have, right, available to you to understand where these deficiencies could be coming from. And then lastly, you referenced risk management failures. It's really about ongoing, I guess, evolution and improvements to your risk management frameworks. And so once again, right, as you're kind of laying out the framework by which and your roadmaps that are driving these frameworks, I think you need to look very deeply inside your practices and your policies and adjust based on where the industry is going.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And like you mentioned, the operational deficiencies is the root cause for having these issues in place. Now, is it because there are difference in interpretation of the regulation given the number of regulations which are coming out every year from multiple regulatory agencies? Or, like you mentioned, deep and broad, that these interpretations have to pass through the entire network within that organization, or insufficient time that the governance spends on making sure that it has actually traversed that operational path, which is responsible for these deficiencies.
So, Venki, I think that the large, important kind of global institutions take all of this very seriously. And I actually think that they are investing and challenging even within, right, the kinds of deficiencies that are being found. But I think that there are a lot of complexities, and the combination of the complexity of the regulations, not necessarily the lack of understanding, because I don't think that that flies all that well, to be quite honest, because, when you're a large premier institution, you have a lot of experts that should be working day in and day out in partnership with the regulators, in fact, to make sure that you understand not only what is required of you, but that you then understand how you're going to go and execute that. So I don't think it's necessarily a lack of understanding, but I do think there's a lot of back and forth and complexity behind all of this, and going back to, making sure you are understand and are up to date, but also the accountability where that lies at the most senior level. But then within the organization, how are you managing
Man,
to make sure that that is well understood and well delineated, right, in terms of accountabilities and ultimately execution, making the changes that you need to make. And I'm a big believer in strong management process. I actually think that strong management process is one of the best ways that senior leadership all the way through the organization can ensure that everybody is aligned. So you may call that governance. I'm calling it a kind of a management process, which incorporates all parts of the organization, incorporates your communication processes, right? Your project management, your documentation, the way in which you're approaching the work that needs to be done, and the ongoing discussions that need to take place across the different parts of the organization to make sure that there's an alignment around, well, what's the implication for us? How do we prioritize that? What policies might we need to change? Are there features to our products that we didn't think about, kind of that now we need to rethink or redesign? That means that everyone across the organization plays a role in this. So when everybody plays a role, it's very difficult, right? There's a level of complexity, and that requires real management discipline. And, and I learned that from my career at Citi. And I think that when things need to get done, right, and there is a good understanding of the importance of it, then the management discipline then dictates how everything gets done. And therefore, kind of the investments, the infrastructure, and the change, right, can take place.
see, Marcia, do I hear that even though the global institutions have become bigger and complex, that there are methods and practices which we could follow and still be in line with the regulator and not get into the consent order situation?
I believe that there are, right? But I believe that a couple of things. There's transparency and communication back and forth. It almost needs to be on a daily basis,
Mrs.
right? It's interesting. In my past, I once had the opportunity to be representing sets of policies on behalf of an institution with, I don't know, a whole room full of regulators. And the need for transparency was so evident that by the end of the, we'll just call it many hours that we spent together, we were aligned. We were on the same page because basically, I think everybody's intent is in the right place. I like to think that. I hope that that's the case, right? So, but there's a difference between intending and actually doing, right? And the difference between that is how well your organization is managed, right? And how well aligned leadership teams are, and the definitions and the communication all the way through to the actual execution. And that is kind of where the rubber hits the road, in my opinion. But I think it's possible.
See, Marcia, that brings to another question that if those roles, responsibilities, and governance can be actually spruced up, are there technological challenges in getting those? Because this requires a lot of data to be crunched in very thin time, which means your data pipelines the quality gates, and the data lineage have to be on top of the order. Are there challenges with regard to them in spite of technologies being available for them for a long time?
So there's always going to be there's always challenges. There's always more to do and not enough time and resource to
This
do
is
it.
true. Okay.
However, again, it goes back to clear definition of what's required and having the experts in the room that understand deep, right, the issues and the data that needs to be brought forward. So in your examples of the technology kind of prioritization and or the data needs and the infrastructure and the lineage, I mean, there are lots of qualified teams, right, that would need to be kind of what I'll say organized in such a way so that they're bringing the relevant information to the, we'll call it the operating management team, so that decisions can be made based on the actual data that's being presented. So yes, there are challenges. There are challenges because oftentimes people work in silos and they themselves don't even understand the power of the data that they're looking at. So once again, kind of this direct correlation between the data, its meaning, its value back in terms not only to the business, but to the compliance and the regulatory requirements, right? That is something that is critical to this entire process. And you need to make sure, and sometimes there is a little bit of lack of accountability in terms of who's really responsible when it comes down to all of the data work, because it's not just data governance, it's data, and everything that's required within data governance, it's the understanding of how that data flows through all of our processes, all of our kind of policies, and what happens as a consequence of that. You really need, and especially today with all the new architectures. So I've spent a good amount of time with a client, right, as they were building new architecture, kind of moving into, say, a more digital environment. And oftentimes going back to that issue of third parties, you bring together different technologies, but often you don't really follow the flow of the data across these third-party systems. And as a result of not following the flow of that data, you will find some type of a gap somewhere along the way. And it may not be designed up front for that. It's found on the back end. That creates a problem. So again, to your point, right, moving this up in the strategic funnel, I think is very important.
Thank you, Marcia. See, finally, I heard a lot of suggestions or best practices that institutions can apply. One, in terms of the interface with the regulator themselves, it has to be constant to make sure that there are no gaps. Second, in terms of the operating models of defining the roles, responsibilities, and accountability for the compliance part itself, and instituting a culture where compliance is as important as business. And the third, which you mentioned, even if technology is available, we need to make sure that people understand what data is important to the regulator and why, and therefore have a better understanding of how the data gets collected, collated, interpreted, and submitted to the regulators. Are there some more best practices which I have not gathered from you, which you would like to indicate?
Well, that was very impressive, Venki. Did I say all of that? No, I think you captured it really, really well. And I just want to say that, and people say this a lot, but I think it's really, really true. There's a reason. Usually there's a reason behind kind of the regulatory responsibilities, and it's good for business to be doing what's good, right, for our clients. And I think that sometimes the more innovative we can be, right, and the more we think through, like, what's really behind the reason for this, then we'll turn that into a business opportunity. Right. And so I don't think that we always need to think about these as, oh, these are the rules we need to follow, but adding on to that, when we do that really well, right, we will find business opportunities, right, because of the way in which we're operating our business.
Quite well, Marcia. And if I might say so, like the sustainability part, there is a responsible banking also possible. That's what I hear from you. And probably between that sustainability and responsible banking, we could have another discussion sometime. But that's what I gather.
I would hope that, but that's for another day.
That's for another day. Thank you so much, Marcia, for being with us.